with a crucial understanding of our business processes, we're able to look at ourselves and relate what we do and how we do it with the requirements in a particular audit criteria. Now, audit criteria can be a whole range of standards or requirements that need to be met. For example, if a client requires a particular contractual deliverable, that is a requirement. And how you interpret it will be delivered is probably going to be explained in maybe a proposal. But likewise, international standards, ISOs, are a list of requirements that somewhere, somehow, within an organization, how they actually do their business in delivering these requirements are met. Before we go into moving on with that particular step and that relationship and understanding between our processes and the audit criteria, I'm just going to mention some sort of a fundamental characteristic. I've got ISO 9001 here. Now, some audit criteria, maybe a client's requirements, might be very explicit. They might be very clear. They might not leave a lot of room for interpretation. If we take, and we'll use again, the airport taxi company hypothetical example, the client requirement might be, in addition to everything else, all chauffeurs are to wear hats, peaked hats. Quite simple, quite clear. Maybe, again, it might be a case of actually finding out even more information. Do they mean baseball caps? Do they mean a sort of police type cap, a presentational cap, one that you'd see on the movies? But this is that interpretation, finding out exactly what the requirement is. And international standards similarly have requirements. However, ISO 9001 is applicable and can be used by almost any organization, be it a business, a not-for-profit charity, a hospital, a engineering works, a security company, a football team, a sports team. They can all use the details within here, the requirements within here, and they can apply them to their operation. Now, if we look into the requirements, you will see nothing overly explicit about a particular industry. That's because if they did that, it would be wrong for all the others. So the characteristic that I want to bring up is how high level and abstract the requirements are, and how the only way to really work out how they relate to your organization is to relate from that high level abstract concept down to the concrete way you do it, how that's done. I'll give an example. It's not out of ISO 9001, but if you imagine a room full of people, I said, everybody, make a sound. Some people might whistle. Some people might clap. Some people might pick up a musical instrument and play a tune. Some people might stamp their feet. Some people, a truck driver, a lorry driver, might sound a horn. A train driver, blow a whistle. As you can see, how it is interpreted is very different for different people in different circumstances. The requirement doesn't change. It was simple, make a sound. How you interpret that is what is so crucial, and it has to be applicable and realistic and appropriate. The term is often used fit for purpose for your operation. My last general example here is if we said to a range of people from different nationalities around the world, what is the best sport in the world? Some people might shout out quite quickly, cricket. Others, baseball. Others, basketball. Football. And even there we have a problem. Some nations, Australia, have a different football from America. Has a different football from the UK and a large portion of the world where football is soccer. So again, interpretation and use of language and terminology and understanding what it means to us is what is an important piece. So moving onward from that, a next step in any preparation, you might well have heard, is to conduct a gap analysis. Now, a gap analysis can give the wrong impression. It can give you the idea that you're going to go searching for the gaps between your operation what you do, and the requirements in a standard. Well, that can be really quite hard to do if you do not actually know how you meet the standard. So, although a gap analysis is a useful term and potentially the first step in actually mapping your organisation against a standard, it's a bit back to front. There's other useful ways of understanding it. It's of the same effect. One might be to produce a compliance matrix or a compliance crosswalk. That means crosswalking from a requirement in the standard to how you do it in your organisation. Requirement in the standard, how you do it in your organisation, how you requirements, etc. You can see that crosswalk sort of piece. Another term is an exposition table. An exposition table means to expose, to make clear, to explain how your organisation does something. Now, that's not a bad use of terminology, because the first audience that you're actually explaining it to, how you're meeting the standard, is in fact your own organisation, yourself, not any external auditor. They come secondary. You need to know how you meet the standard before you can move forward with any understanding of your conformance to an audit criteria. Another phrase, another term I particularly like, not that it matters, is interpretation document. Because it's a document, it might be a Word document, it could be an Excel document, it could be any manner of formats, it doesn't really matter. It could be written on a whiteboard, as I've been doing up to now, and a photograph taken of it to keep it as a record, so it can be referred back to at a later date. But it is a document that interprets the requirement standard with how you achieve it. So let's start by drawing up a interpretation document. I've drawn up my table, my interpretation document, gap analysis. It's a dual purpose tool. I've given myself a number of columns: requirement, internal controls, process, process owner, and output evidence. I'll explain each one. The requirement, that's the requirement of the audit criteria. So if it's ISO 9001, it might be that I select in order, or the order is irrelevant, but pick a particular clause that I'm going to interpret. So it could be 9.1.2, customer satisfaction. If, however, I'm looking at explicitly or vaguely communicated client requirements, and if we use our example of the airport taxi company, where the requirement from the client is that all chauffeurs will wear a hat, the requirement can be put in there, and in either the words as in the proposal or as expressed in whatever method. So all drivers are to wear hats. Now, that's the requirement. It's quite clear. That's what the client wants, and we've agreed to provide that. The internal controls, how we are going to control and achieve that. Another way of just seeing this is how we do it. They've asked for all drivers to wear hats. How do we give them all the drivers wearing hats? Simply what we're going to put in here. What we're not going to do, which is so frequently done in ISO manuals and other time-wasting information documentation, is regurgitating the language from here to here, or what I often call parroting, as in a bird that is just repeating language which it doesn't really understand, just repeating it word for word. There's absolutely no point in that, adds no value, and just wastes time. An example of parroting or regurgitating would be to say, my company's drivers will all wear hats. My company's drivers will all wear hats. Well, that actually hasn't told me anything. It's not interpreted that whatsoever. It's just turned the language from a request, from a requirement, into a statement of intent. Sure, I know all my company's drivers will be wearing hats. How is that going to happen? Thinking business-wise, how are we going to achieve that? Well, let's go in a few steps. One, let's buy some hats. buy hats. Now, doing that, we can think about the purchase process. Two, issue hats. Provide training. Provide training or provide information. It might be providing instructions. It might not require any training to say to someone, hey, when you go and pick up this client, make sure you're wearing your hat. It might just require an instruction. Be aware when you go pick up this client, wear a hat. But that is a control. That's how we achieve our customers' requirements. We can associate processes with these internal controls. Buying hats. Well, we know we've got a purchase process. Issuing of hats, we can allocate this to the dispatch process. Again, I'm now creating something as opposed to reflecting what we actually already do. Provide training. As you can see, you can identify a process relative to the activity and identify the process owner. So we've got John, we've got Jan, we've got Mark. These are the people responsible for these activities. All of these activities deliver against that requirement. Now here, we've got output, the evidence. If these activities are undertaken, there will be an output, there'll be a byproduct. When something is done, often something is a consequential result. So if we should buy hats, there will be records that hats were purchased. That might be receipts or purchase orders. Issuing a hat, we might actually have, they might be quite valuable. So you might have a list of the people we've issued the hats to. They might well sign to be held accountable for the hat, not losing the hat. So issue log, issue record. So we know who we issued it to. So we don't issue 2 hats to one person. It doesn't need to. Provide training. That might be we have a lesson plan. And then we have an attendees list of who turns up to receive the training. If it is something of such importance that it really can't be left unchecked, we might put in place at the end of the training an exam, a verification test to ensure that the instructions weren't just passed from the instructor to the attendee, but were actually taken in. So was it learned? Have they actually assimilated the information? So a verification test. All of these give us an indication that that's being done. We can also actually look at the drivers before they depart. So we could put in place, as part of the dispatch process, an inspection, a dress inspection, to make sure the turnout is the standard we want them to be in. So, dispatch. And that will be evidence as well, the fact that they are tidy and clean. There's not always a reason to keep a record. It might just be an activity that's done. And it's, we could ask John how many times people failed to turn up without their hats. It doesn't need to be recorded necessarily. Again, it is all dependent. So, come an actual audit, this column also has a secondary use. It allows us to see the verifiable evidence that substantiates these activities, which we know achieve that requirement. We're now going to turn back to an international standard, in this case ISO 9001. And I'm going to use a couple of clauses, requirements, which are fairly generic and to all international standards, regardless. ISO 9001 being a very foundational level one. 9.1.2 and 9.2 internal audit. So let's look at these in a bit more detail. In creating an interpretation document, and in so doing, conducting a gap analysis, we can see in the left column, in the requirements column, we've put the requirements, the clauses of ISO 9001:2015 down the left. Now you can see here I've put in requirement number 9.1.2, customer satisfaction. The organisation shall monitor customers' perceptions of the degree to which their needs and expectations have been fulfilled. The organisation shall determine
The methods for obtaining, monitoring and reviewing this information. So how have we done that? If we look at our internal controls and our arrangements for achieving that, we have the following arrangements in place. Our drivers will routinely ask passengers if they had a comfortable journey. Really quite simple. Customer satisfactions may be sent out or are sent out, and we can do that at a particular ratio. 1 in 5, 1 in 10, really it's up to you. It gives us an indication, gives us feedback that we can use to understand the perception and the satisfaction or not from our customers. There's actually all manner of key performance indicators, KPIs, that we can use. The number of repeat clients can be recorded, and it tells us, again, the level of satisfaction that they are having and whether or not they're moving to another supplier and moving away from our organisation due to dissatisfaction. The process that this is being understood in is the performance and assurance process, or the performance excellence process. The process owner I've identified here is the Chief Operating Officer. Now, it can be any title. It doesn't have to be particularly Chief Operating Officer, but it gives you the understanding that it's the person who's in charge of operations, because they're the ones most in tune with how customers are perceiving the service. The output. So drivers' verbal reports of the passenger satisfaction. Now you'll notice this is not a document. This is not a record. This is not a record which is retained to be read later. This is someone explaining something. This is a verbal report. So a lot of evidence can be observations of activities being undertaken or statements from someone expressing an actual statement of fact. However, there are also a lot of outputs which are records, and records do have a lot of value as well. But we have records, observations, verbal statements. So as you can see, the next one is return surveys. Those are records. And records of repeat customers. The next line we've got, the next requirement we're looking at is internal audit. Requirement number 9.2. I do wish to stress here that these particular clauses that you're seeing, customer satisfaction, internal audit, they've been selected purely as examples. They are not the only ones to be doing an interpretation document against by any means. No, you will be wanting to identify how you meet all the requirements of any particular audit criteria, any particular standard that you as an organisation wish to conform to. And these have just been selected as they're fairly generic, common to most standards, and give you a flavour, an idea of exactly how this process is taken. And we'll look at this as it's actually got a number of sub-requirements in, if you like. As you can see, 9.2 point. The organisation, that's us, so I often just put our own name in here. My taxi company. Shall conduct internal audits at planned intervals. How are we achieving that though, that particular planned intervals? In this example, as with all other examples that I'm putting in here, MSS Global is not giving a solution that you should necessarily follow, as all companies will be looking at doing what is fit for their purposes, and they need to come up with their own best practice solution. And other examples of how to manage an internal audit program might be to have a separate schedule which can be operated as a project plan. But I'm just using a very simple example here of using the company calendar. And the output from putting a schedule into the company calendar would be entries visible in the company calendar that can be followed. The next requirement within this particular clause is quite complex and quite in depth, and so actually rather than put too much information in this particular column, internal controls, I've detailed the instructions for how we will do internal audits in my organisation on a particular document, and we've called it the internal audit instruction document. And as you can see here, there is a hyperlink included, or just a reference, so people know where to go. So the information isn't in this column, but it's referring to where the document is that will provide the information that answers how we achieve that requirement. The output from actually following the internal audit instructions will be audit reports, and there should be a report for each scheduled internal audit. The last clause we've put in here, the last requirement, requirement 9.3, management review. Top management, that's the leaders of my taxi company, shall review the taxi company's business management system, how we deliver our business at planned intervals. Again, planned intervals is quite likely we'd put this in a calendar as a schedule so everybody knew when to turn up for particular meetings, to ensure its continuing suitability, adequacy, effectiveness and alignment with our business strategic direction. Now, just in this example, I've looked into how we do this as a small organisation, and sure, we might have had a lot of business meetings to begin with, but they seem to have tailed off. And I'm being honest with myself now, and I've identified there are no company arrangements in place that meet this requirement. So we've got a gap. As you can see, a gap has been identified, and this now gives us an obvious objective to plan to close this gap. But only by doing an interpretation document or understanding how we meet the requirements can we identify our gaps. It's an interesting point now to look at what an external assessor will be doing when they come and visit. Well, their first visit, they'll be coming to understand your planned arrangements for delivering your service. They'll be looking at those internal controls and the processes to identify the process steps and the internal controls, and understanding how those internal controls achieve the requirements. They'll be looking at the internal controls and what is produced. What is the output of those internal controls that can be verifiably checked to see that the internal controls, the arrangements, are being put into effect. The second visit, or the audit of effectiveness, will be when the actual audit of delivery is carried out. And this generally follows the processes, the business processes. So it's the processes that are being audited to see that they are meeting the requirements. How are the business processes audited? How are they checked that they historically and recently have been delivered as per the plan? The outputs, which are sampled in just the same way as you sample the outputs, the evidence that substantiates your practices, your protocols, your procedures, your way of doing business is being put into effect as per your plan, as per your system.
Okay, moving back to an overall view of our requirements document, our interpretation map, our interpretation document and gap analysis. Here I've listed a number of ISO 9001 requirements down. We go through those just as we've done, identifying how we do it, what controls we have in place, our arrangements that we have in organisation to achieve these aims. And we put the information, and then we suddenly come across a particular area and we're not too sure. So let's move on. So I've come to the conclusion here through lack of actually being able to recognise how in our operation we achieve the requirement of 7.1.3 infrastructure, because we don't actually understand that, we don't know it, we've not recognised it. We are now presented with a gap. So gap analysis isn't hunting for the gaps, it's allowing the gaps to be revealed through their absence. Now, if you haven't realised, creating a interpretation document or conducting a gap analysis against a standard and your genuine business activities is no small task. It's quite formidable. And to be honest, probably never complete. Because as your business changes, as requirements adjust, as your context and operating environment fluctuates, so will your response to the requirements. And so your internal controls may adjust and change. This is an important document to make sure that you don't lose your conformity against a requirement by deciding that something's too much like hard work. So we've stopped doing that. Little do we realise that we've lost conformity to a requirement of a standard that is of importance to us. However, how do we do this in a stage process that gives us some results quite quickly? With the requirements noted down there and taking the time to read them and interpret them and understand what it is they are trying to elicit and their intent, what we can do is we can go straight to identifying not necessarily the internal control, but if we understand what that is, hang on, what process is it that that's done in? So we might well look at a particular process and decide, for example, 7.1.2, people. The organisation shall determine and provide the persons necessary for the effective implementation of its management system and for the operational and control of its processes. So when we understand that to be about having the right people in place to achieve our aim without anybody being too overly frazzled and allowing us to deliver reliably, then we might not put down all the internal controls that are present because it might be a formidable number, but we might actually have a human resources document that already explains that and details how we do it. So we might just put in a reference to that document. See Human Resources Manual. Nothing else needs to be written in here. This is now just pointing to another location where the information is far better presented. So this can be seen as an index as well. It can explain in quite length and be the sole location for that information, or it can include hyperlinks or just simple references to indicate to the reader where they need to go to get that information. Now, again, this suggests that actually we don't even have that, and we are trying to make some progress here. Understanding that 7.1.2 is about people, human resources, we can understand that the process that is most likely to be encompassed by is our recruitment process. And our recruitment process is headed up by John. What this means is we're already immediately able to see this requirement and go to John and find out from John, the process owner, how these requirements are met. These are the people who understand the processes the best and are so the most likely to really give you an understanding of the internal controls, or might tell you where they've already got it written down. It might be on a small piece of paper beside their computer, or it could be in a very polished corporate looking document. It depends on the scale of the operation of the organisation. Met.
Important point. Not every internal control or arrangement within your organisation needs documenting. Indeed, to document everything an organisation does would leave little time for anything else. If we understand documents as simply supporting tools to aid an already competent person or team to do their job well, then we can get a common sense approach, a risk-based approach, to what needs documenting and what does not. A simple way to determine if something needs documenting for someone to refer back to is to ask the question, so what? So what? If we don't document instructions or provide sufficient standard operating procedures, and so leaving the outcome to the training an individual has received, or to their common sense judgment, or possibly even leaving the outcome to chance, would it be a problem? If the answer is genuinely no, then there is no requirement to spend exhaustive effort in unnecessary documentation. However, if the repercussions of an activity being undertaken wrongly are intolerable, then proportional supporting arrangements need to be made, including documenting a consistent approach to achieving that activity.
And again, the output is going to be known by John, the process owner of recruitment. So the first step to doing a gap analysis is to understand the requirements understand who in your organisation is delivering on those requirements, who's dealing with those requirements, principally the most important person doing that. In much the same way, I can put in the processes that relate to these other clauses. 6.2, we're looking at objectives and plans to achieve them. So we might be looking at the business planning process for the whole of 6.2, 2.1, 2.2. In big handfuls, service delivery planning, and the owner is Mark. I would argue that actually it wouldn't be the only individual. Probably the chief operations officer would have a very, very important role in this. Probably might well be the process owner for the objectives of that service delivery. But again, we're in a position to find out who it is. So when a external assessor comes to your organisation and they want to understand how it is you achieve these particular requirements, you're able to bring them to the owner of the process that's most likely to encompass those or achieve those requirements. And the assessor is going to be in a good position to discuss and draw out from the individual the activities they do and recognise and correlate the requirements with your business activities. Now, that doesn't mean that's all you've got to do. Again, getting an actual understanding in more detail progressively, how you do it is the progressive aim of an interpretation document. I trust these presentations have been of benefit and they've given you a few steps to understand your organisation relative to these international standards and prepare yourselves for an MSS Global Assessor visiting. Now, there's been a lot of use of the word interpretation. It's a vital understanding that you have about how your business meets any particular audit criteria, be that customers or an international standard. MSS Global cannot consult. It cannot give specific solutions to your company. Hence these general but educational presentations. Because what MSS Global can do is it can interpret. We can interpret the requirements of the standard and bring them more down to an understanding of a particular industry sector. But we cannot give you a particular business solution. We cannot own the solution. To be honest, we much prefer to provide you with the knowledge, the know-how to take control of this and own it yourselves. And then you're in a far more powerful position to sustain your success. So my last parting points now are that MSS Global have produced some interpretation tutorials based on the high-level structure or the structure of international standards, and they move from the very generic understanding of the intent down to more concrete understandings of businesses and how they can approach and achieve or meet the requirements. Thank you.